1. The Brave Knight and the Sage's Advice. In a faraway kingdom nestled between tall mountains and deep forests there lived a courageous knight named Rowan. His reputation for bravery was known far and wide, but despite his strength and skill in battle, Rowan often sought guidance from an elderly sage who lived on the outskirts of the kingdom. The sage, with his long silver beard and deep-set eyes that seemed to hold centuries of wisdom, had become a trusted mentor to the knight. Whenever Rowan faced challenges that his sword couldn't solve, he would visit the sage, eager to understand the mysteries of life. The sage's home was simple, a small wooden hut surrounded by a beautiful garden filled with herbs and wildflowers. The air always seemed calmer ere the sage and Rowan would sit with him for hours, listening to his advice on life, fate, and the world beyond the battlefield. No matter the problem, in a rigorous training session with his fellow knights. The air rang with the sound of clashing swords and the shouts of men perfecting their battle skills. Rowan, always determined to sharpen his abilities, was practicing a particularly difficult maneuver, one that required speed and precision. As he swung his sword attempting to strike a perfect blow, his foot slipped on the dew-covered grass. His balance faltered, and before he could regain control, the sword slipped from his grasp. In a flash of pain, the blade caught his hand, severing one of his fingers. Rowan cried out and dropped to his knees, clutching his bleeding hand. His comrades rushed to his aid, wrapping his hand in cloth and helping him back to the barracks. Though the bleeding was soon controlled, the damage was done. His finger was gone, and with it Rowan felt a wave of frustration and despair. How could he, a knight of such renown, make such a careless mistake? How could he let this happen? For days Rowan remained in a dark mood, avoiding his fellow knights and barely speaking. His once steady grip on his sword now felt awkward and unfamiliar without his finger, and the frustration weighed heavily on his heart. "I am a warrior," he muttered to himself, "and yet I've failed at the simplest task of protecting my own body." In his anger, Rowan decided to visit the sage. Though he had always respected the old man's wisdom, this time he was filled with doubt. Surely this injury was a cruel twist of fate, with no hidden meaning, no blessing in disguise. How could the loss of his finger be for the better? When Rowan arrived at the sage's hut, the elderly man greeted him with his usual calm demeanor. Without a word, the sage could sense Rowan's pain, both physical and emotional. Rowan explained what had happened, his voice filled with frustration. "I've lost a finger, sage. How can you possibly say that this is for the better? I've made a mistake, and I've paid dearly for it." The sage looked at Rowan with a knowing smile, his eyes soft with understanding. "I know this must feel like a great burden to you now, Rowan," he said gently. "But as I've always told you, everything happens for a reason, even when it seems cruel or senseless. This injuries, even this, is for your greater good." Rowan clenched his fists, his frustration boiling over. "How can the loss of my finger be a good thing? I can barely hold my sword properly anymore. I am a knight, and now I'm less than whole." The sage's smile didn't falter. "Time will reveal the truth, brave knight. You may not see it now, but there is a purpose in this. Trust that life is unfolding exactly as it should. Rowan left the sage's home that day feeling no more comforted than when he had arrived. The sage's words felt hollow in the face of his pain. Yet despite his frustration, a small part of him still clung to the hope that perhaps, just perhaps, the old man's wisdom held some truth that would one day make sense. 3. The knight's anger and departure. As days turned into weeks, Rowan's frustration only deepened. Every time he practiced with his sword, the absence of his finger was a constant reminder of his perceived failure. His movements were slower, clumsy even, and the knight who had once been known for his precision and strength now felt weaker than ever. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult training session, Rowan decided he had had enough. "I can't do this anymore," he muttered under his breath. The sage's words, which once gave him peace, now only irritated him. He stormed out of the castle and rode back to the sage's hut, his heart full of anger and confusion. When he arrived, the sage greeted him with his usual calm expression, but Rowan couldn't hold back his fury. "You keep telling me that everything happens for the better," Rowan shouted. "But nothing about this is better. I've lost my strength, my pride, and my ability as a knight. I don't see any purpose in this pain." The sage listened patiently, never interrupting. When Rowan had finished, the old man simply replied, "I understand your pain, Rowan. But as I've said before, you will see the truth in time. Trust the journey." Rowan couldn't bear to hear it any longer. He turned away, leaving the sage without another word. From that moment, Rowan decided to distance himself from the sage's advice and rely on his own strength and will. He refused to visit the sage again, convinced that his injury had no deeper meaning. 4. The knight's adventure and getting lost. Months later, Rowan decided it was time for a new challenge. A distant land was said to hold a hidden treasure deep within a perilous forest guarded by mythical beasts and treacherous terrain. Determined to prove to himself that he was still the knight he once was, Rowan set off on a solo adventure, hoping to reclaim his pride and strength through this dangerous quest. For days he journeyed through thick forests, crossing rivers and climbing rocky cliffs. The further he ventured, the more isolated and treacherous the landscape became. His skills were tested at every turn, and though his missing finger made certain tasks harder, Rowan pushed through, determined to succeed. One evening, while chasing a fleeting glimpse of a mythical creature said to guard the treasure, Rowan realized he had wandered far from his original path. As the sun set, he found himself deep in the heart of the forest, far from any familiar landmarks. His horse had bolted in fear, and with the thick trees and fading light, Rowan was utterly lost. Frustration and exhaustion overwhelmed him. He wandered aimlessly, calling for help, but there was no one to answer. The dense forest seemed to close in around him, and he began to fear he would never find his way back. '5. The mysterious mountain tribe. As Rowan searched for a way out, he suddenly heard the sound of drums echoing through the trees. Curious but cautious, he followed the sound until he stumbled upon a group of people, an isolated mountain tribe that lived deep within the forest, far from the kingdom's reach. They were dressed in strange, colorful clothes, their faces painted with intricate symbols, and they seemed to be in the middle of some sort of celebration. Before Rowan could react, the tribe's people spotted him and quickly surrounded him. Their leader, a tall man with feathers in his hair and a fierce expression, approached Rowan and spoke in a language the knight did not understand. Rowan tried to explain who he was, but the tribe seemed uninterested in his words. The tribe was in search of a human to offer as a sacrifice to their gods. To them, Rowan was the perfect candidate. They seized him and bound him, preparing him for their ritual. Rowan's heart pounded in his chest as they led him to a sacred altar where he was to be offered as a sacrifice to appease their deity. 6. A twist of fate, the missing finger. Rowan watched helplessly as the tribe began their preparations. They washed him, dressed him in ceremonial robes and placed a crown of flowers on his head. The drums beat louder and the chanting grew more intense as the moment of sacrifice drew near. Rowan knew there was no escape, he was outnumbered and bound. His fate seemed sealed. But just as the tribe's leader was about to complete the ritual, something unexpected happened. The leader noticed Rowan's hand, more specifically the missing finger. The leader called for the drums to stop and closely examined Rowan's hand, then turned to the other tribe members and spoke with urgency. The leader explained to the tribe that the gods would not accept an incomplete sacrifice. To offer someone with a missing limb would anger the gods rather than please them. The missing finger made Rowan unworthy as a sacrifice, and so in a strange twist of fate the tribe released him. Rowan could hardly believe it. The very injury that had caused him so much pain and frustration had now saved his life. The tribe, believing he was no longer fit for their ritual, let him go, and Rowan quickly fled into the forest, heart pounding with relief. 7. The Knight's Realization. After many hours of wandering, Rowan finally made his way out of the forest and back to familiar ground. Exhausted but alive, he sat down on the edge of a riverbank, staring at his hand, the hand that had once felt so incomplete but had now become his salvation. In that moment Rowan remembered the sage's words, "Whatever happens, happens for the better." He finally understood. If he had never lost his finger, the tribe would have sacrificed him without hesitation. What he had seen as a terrible misfortune had actually saved his life. The sage had been right all along. Tears filled Rowan's eyes, not from sadness but from the overwhelming realization that life had a way of working things out even when it seemed impossible. His heart was filled with gratitude, not just for his survival but for the wisdom he had finally gained. 8. The Reunion with the Sage. Upon returning to the kingdom, Rowan's first act was to visit the sage. This time he wasn't seeking answers but offering thanks. When he arrived at the sage's hut, the old man greeted him with a warm, knowing smile. "I see you've learned the truth, Rowan," the sage said, his eyes twinkling with understanding. Rowan nodded, humbled by his experience. "You were right," he said. "I didn't understand before, but now I do. Losing my finger, it saved my life. And all this time I thought it was just bad luck." The sage placed a hand on Rowan's shoulder. "Life has a way of teaching us what we need to learn in its own time," he said. "The road may be hard and the lessons may seem cruel, but trust that everything unfolds as it should. You have found your strength not through your sword but through your heart." 9. The Final Lesson, Trust in Fate. From that day forward Rowan carried the sage's wisdom in his heart. He returned to his duties as a knight, but with a new perspective on life. He no longer saw challenges as misfortunes but as opportunities for growth and understanding. The loss of his finger, once a source of shame, became a symbol of his survival, his resilience, and a greater plan that guided his life. Whenever faced with hardship, Rowan would smile softly to himself and remember the sage's words, "Whatever happens, happens for the better." And so the knight who had once relied solely on his strength and skill now walked the path of wisdom, trusting in the unseen forces that shaped his destiny.